What if the biggest change in this war did not happen on the battlefield, but inside Putin's head? What if Moscow has decided that waiting, warning, and watching are over, and that the next move will force Europe and Washington to react instead of pretend? Before we go one step further, do me one favor. Like this video if you want straight talk without the noise. Subscribe if you want the next big shift before everyone else catches up. And share this with one person who still thinks the world can stay exactly as it is. For years, the pattern looked familiar. Russia would issue a warning, the West would dismiss it. Ukraine would get another package, another promise, another political speech. Europe would say it stood firm. Washington would say it was defending order. And the war would keep grinding forward, one brutal month after another. But now something feels different. Not louder, not more dramatic on the surface, different in a colder way. Language coming from Moscow has sharpened. The patience sounds thinner. The signals are more direct. The message is no longer, please understand our red lines. The message now sounds closer to, you heard us, ignored us, and now you will live with the consequences. That is why this moment matters. Because when leaders stop trying to persuade and start trying to impose, the whole game changes. And that is exactly what many analysts, including Colonel Douglas Macgregor, believe we may be watching right now. Not just another phase of the Ukraine war, but the start of a wider strategic shift. A shift where Russia stops assuming the West will compromise. A shift where Moscow acts as if escalation is no longer a risk to avoid, but a tool to use. If that is true, then the real question is not whether Putin changed the game. The real question is what happens next when every side still thinks it can control events. To understand that, we need to step back. Putin's position has always been built on two beliefs. First, time helps Russia more than it helps the West. Second, the West is less united than it looks. Even when NATO appears solid on camera, Moscow has long believed that underneath the speeches, the alliance is tired, divided, expensive to maintain, and politically fragile. There is evidence that the Kremlin still thinks this way. In a major speech last year, Putin openly framed Europe not as a possible partner, but as a central enemy bloc that had chosen militarization. Analysts at the European Council on Foreign Relations said the speech pointed to three things: more military pressure, more efforts to exploit anti-establishment politics inside Europe, and more attempts to work around Europe by dealing directly with Washington's source. That matters because it tells us this is not just about the front lines in Ukraine. It is about political pressure inside Europe. It is about psychological pressure on NATO. It is about showing that the cost of resistance will keep rising. And when you connect that with the other global crisis now hanging over the West, the picture gets even darker. Because this is not happening in a vacuum. The United States is also dealing with the aftershocks of war in the Middle East. Europe is dealing with energy risk, inflation risk, industrial weakness, and growing public frustration. Central bankers and policymakers have warned that a prolonged Iran conflict could push the world toward lower growth. Higher inflation, supply shocks, and even stagflation could result from these overlapping crises. CNBC reported that officials were warning about energy disruption, higher consumer prices, and major uncertainty, tied to the Strait of Hormuz, where critical flows of oil, fertilizer, sulfur, helium, and petrochemicals could be affected source. That means Putin may be looking at the West and seeing exactly what he has always wanted to see: distraction, division, fatigue, economic pressure, political fear. And if he believes those conditions are real, then from Moscow's point of view, this may be the perfect time to harden its position. Now, let's be careful here. A lot of commentary online jumps from Russia is getting tougher to World War III starts tomorrow. That kind of panic gets clicks, but it does not help us think clearly. What we need to ask is much simpler. What kind of change are we actually talking about? There are at least four possibilities. The first is military escalation inside Ukraine. This is the most obvious scenario. Russia could increase the pace, scale, or precision of strikes on command centers and infrastructure. It could go harder after logistics hubs, defense industry sites, or decision-making targets that it previously approached with restraint. If Moscow believes the war is drifting and that Western involvement keeps deepening, then harsher action becomes easier to justify. Macgregor has argued that Moscow may be reaching exactly that point. In a May 2026 interview, he said Russian officials were signaling that they had listened long enough and were now ready to end the war. He also suggested that recent Russian warnings to foreign diplomats were a clue that a more forceful phase was coming source. Whether that forecast proves right or not, the important point is this: when one side concludes restraint brought no reward, the temptation to escalate becomes much stronger. The second possibility is pressure beyond Ukraine. This is where things get more dangerous in a modern way. Not tanks rolling into a NATO capital. Not a dramatic declaration on television. Something murkier, more deniable, more constant. Cyber pressure, information warfare, airspace incidents, sabotage fears, political interference, pressure on undersea cables, transport routes, border zones, or critical infrastructure. Enough to raise anxiety. Enough to force new spending. enough to expose weak points, but maybe not enough to trigger a full military response. That strategy fits Russian logic very well. It stretches opponents without giving them a clean, simple moment of unity. It turns security into a permanent cost. It asks European publics a painful question. How much risk, how much inflation, and how much instability are you really willing to absorb? And that question matters more now because Europe is already under strain. Reuters recently reported that German officials were cautiously speaking of a possible future window for dialogue. But even that came with heavy uncertainty and the recognition that any real breakthrough could still be far away source. So even while Europe tries to project firmness, it is also quietly thinking about endurance. That alone tells you something. The third possibility is diplomatic inversion. This may sound technical, but it is deeply important. Diplomatic inversion means Russia tries to make itself look like the side open to settlement while making the West look like the side prolonging chaos. The military struggle stays brutal, but the political frame changes. Moscow's goal would be to say to the world, we offered terms, we asked for security, we warned about escalation, and the West chose ideology over realism. If that narrative gains ground outside the transatlantic bloc, Russia gains room to maneuver. Not because everyone suddenly loves Moscow, but because many countries care more about stability, energy prices, and food costs. And that brings us to the fourth possibility, the biggest one of all, strategic timing. Putin may believe the West is entering a season of political weakness. Think about the pressure points, elections, inflation, war fatigue, elite division, rising defense costs, social distrust. The slow realization that modern wars are not short, clean, or cheap. Now add the Middle East. The European Union Institute for Security Studies warned that the Iran war created severe risks for global trade, noting that about a third of the world's seaborne oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz. It also described sharp initial jumps in prices and warned that escalation could spread wider source. From Moscow's perspective, this is not background noise. This is opportunity. A West that must divide money, weapons, and attention across multiple crises is a West with less freedom. A West that has to calm angry voters at home is a West with less strategic patience. A West that keeps saying as long as it takes while quietly worrying about the bill is a West that may blink. And Putin only needs to believe that blinking is possible. He does not need certainty. He just needs enough confidence to keep pressing. Now here is where things get emotionally difficult for people, because many viewers want the story to be simple. They want a clean villain and a clean ending. But history almost never gives us that. Instead, history gives us leaders gambling on what the other side can endure. It gives us publics told that sacrifice will be temporary. It gives us officials claiming control while events outrun them. That may be the most dangerous part of this moment. Not that Putin is strong, not that NATO is weak. The danger is that every camp may be underestimating how much pressure is building at once. Russia may underestimate the ability of Europe to harden over time. Europe may underestimate how far Russia is willing to go. Washington may underestimate the cost of trying to manage two major theaters at once, and ordinary people may underestimate how fast economic pain can turn political. If you're still with me, hit subscribe, like you're marking a map before the storm. Tap like if you want more analysis that cuts through slogans, and share this video with a friend who says nothing ever changes. So what happens next? There are several paths, and none of them are comfortable. One path is controlled escalation. That means Russia intensifies pressure, but stays below the threshold of direct NATO entry. Europe responds with more aid and louder rhetoric, but the cost keeps spreading outward through budgets and energy. This is probably the path many policymakers secretly hope for, because it feels manageable. But manageable does not mean safe. A long war changes countries. It drains stockpiles, it reshapes elections. It hardens language. It rewards fear. It turns emergency decisions into normal policy. It teaches whole populations to live inside permanent instability. Another path is coercive shock. This is the scenario where Russia tries to create a dramatic change in expectations by doing something sharp enough that leaders in Kiev, Brussels, and Washington all feel the ground move. A strike pattern changes. A major city faces new fear. A critical system goes down. A warning becomes action. And suddenly, what was once discussed as theory becomes reality. If that happens, the first battle is narrative. Was this inevitable? Who crossed what line? Who now has to respond? Who can still climb down without looking weak? Modern conflict is about credibility, and credibility is addictive. Once leaders build their image around resolve, backing away is expensive. That is why miscalculation becomes so easy. Each side says the other side is bluffing. There's also a path that gets far less attention: internal pressure inside Western democracies. If living costs rise again and growth weakens, the political center in several countries may come under more pressure. The Guardian reported that economists still warned of a long shadow over the global economy, including higher fuel prices source. This matters because wars are not sustained by speeches alone. They are sustained by societies and wallets. Once that trust cracks, the whole political atmosphere changes, and voters start asking, why are we paying for this? And when that shift happens, foreign policy elites can lose the room very quickly. Now, does that mean Europe is about to collapse into rebellion? No. Serious analysis requires discipline. Public anger can grow without turning into revolution. Governments can become unpopular without falling overnight. But it would be a mistake to ignore the trend. Across much of the West, trust is thinner than leaders admit. Many voters feel unheard. Many believe major institutions protect themselves first. Many think elections change the language, but not the direction. That is fertile ground for political shocks. Putin knows this. He does not need to create every fracture. He only needs to widen the ones that exist. Change the game means changing the pressure system around the war. It means making the war harder to isolate. It means forcing the West to feel the conflict not as a distant debate, but as a strategic tax on everything. Energy, security, budgets, confidence, political unity, time. And here is the uncomfortable truth. That strategy can work even without a decisive battlefield breakthrough. If your enemy becomes more divided and distracted, then you are already changing the battlefield by changing their mind. This is why the most important developments happen far from the front. Inside finance ministries and campaign war rooms, wars are also decided by patience, production, persuasion, and pain tolerance. Which society can absorb more? Which leadership can adapt faster? Which narrative survives longer? Which public loses faith first? Those are the real questions now. And that brings us back to Putin. If he has changed the game, his bet is that the West cannot stay focused and resilient long enough. That is a serious bet. And it is not irrational, but it is still a bet. Russia has costs too. Military costs, economic costs, demographic costs, diplomatic costs, strategic overreach risks. A harder Russian posture could produce harder Western responses and strengthen European defense coordination. It could accelerate military investment that Moscow later regrets or convince hesitant publics the threat is real. Changing the game does not guarantee winning. Sometimes it only guarantees that everyone pays more. So the next phase may be defined by a brutal contest of endurance. Not who trends hardest online, but who can actually bear the weight of the world they are helping create. What happens next is not one event. It is a sequence, a chain reaction, a test of nerves. More pressure from Russia, more strain in Europe, more dilemmas in Washington, more uncertainty in markets, more arguments inside democracies, more chances for miscalculation. That is the road ahead unless the cycle breaks. Maybe negotiations gain traction. Maybe back channels finally matter. Maybe one side decides risks are too high. But right now, the momentum does not point toward relief. It points toward harder decisions. And here is where I want to say something plainly. Ordinary people usually feel these turning points last. Experts debate, politicians posture. But families notice the cost first. At the pump, at the store, in the sense of the future. That is when geopolitics stops being abstract. That is when a faraway conflict enters your kitchen. That is when the phrase, the game change, stops sounding dramatic and starts sounding personal. On television, they can still say deterrence and resilience, but the public measures reality in a different language. Can I afford fuel? Will my job still be here? Why does every crisis somehow become permanent? Those questions move into elections and editorial rooms. They move into the choices governments make when budgets get tighter. The next phase may be decided by whether Western leaders can persuade their own people that the cost has a plan, because once the public feels drift instead of direction, support becomes much more fragile. So yes, watch Putin. But also watch whether the West can explain itself with more than slogans. Watch whether it can match sacrifice with strategy and tell voters what victory would actually look like. If it cannot do that, then Russia only needs to keep the pressure high enough for doubt to spread. Support the channel. Leave a comment with the one move you think the West is still refusing to face. Subscribe so you do not miss the next piece, and send this video to someone who follows headlines. So let's end where we began. Has Putin really changed the game? He may not have changed every fact on the ground yet, but he appears to be changing the assumptions. The assumption that Russia will keep absorbing pressure. The assumption that Europe can stay steady no matter the cost. The assumption that the United States can manage multiple crises without exhaustion. The assumption that time favors the West. Once those assumptions weaken, the board looks different, and every leader starts making different choices. This moment feels tense because the old script may be dying. And when old scripts die, dangerous people improvise. Desperate governments improvise. Overconfident alliances improvise. Markets improvise. Voters improvise. That is not stability. That is the precondition for shock. If Putin believes the West is stretched, he will press. If Europe believes backing down invites danger, it will resist. If Washington believes credibility is on the line, it will escalate. In that environment, even a small trigger can become a major event, One strike, one signal, one panic. The next chapter begins not with certainty, but with pressure, fear, pride, and timing. So watch the speeches, watch the stockpiles, watch energy prices, and watch diplomacy that happens off camera. Watch for the moment when one side stops testing limits and starts trying to redraw them. Because if that moment is here, then this is no longer just a war being fought, it is a wider system being stressed. And stressed systems do not always crack slowly. Sometimes they snap. The game may already be changing. The next move may already be forming. It will reveal who was paying attention